Hello, soul-igniting story fam. Buckle up because today's tale is packed with sweetness and swoon-worthy magic. Let's jump straight into the story. What if I told you that a university janitor held the key to unlocking a millionaire son's potential and the secret he shared to transform anyone's life forever? Have you ever felt like you're failing despite having every advantage? Like the world has handed you everything on a silver platter, yet somehow you're still drowning? Today's story will shake you to your core because it reveals how the most unlikely person became the greatest teacher, and the lesson he taught could change your life starting today. We're about to journey into the gleaming towers of Chicago, where glass and steel reach toward the clouds like monuments to human ambition. At the very top of Wellington Tower sits a penthouse worth more money than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. But wealth, as you're about to discover, can't buy the one thing that matters most. Meet Caleb Mercer, 19 years old, trust fund baby, son of tech billionaire Richard Mercer, whose software empire spans continents. His mother, a former opera star turned philanthropist who moves through high society like royalty. Caleb has access to the finest tutors money can hire, attends the most prestigious university in the country, and his future should be guaranteed. But here's where the story gets shocking. Caleb is failing. Not just struggling completely, utterly failing every single exam he takes. His professors whisper about him in faculty lounges. His classmates watch him with a mixture of pity and disbelief. How can someone with unlimited resources, the best education money can buy, and every door in the world ready to open for him, fail so spectacularly? The truth is more devastating than you might expect. Caleb doesn't know how to learn. He's never had to develop discipline. Never faced real consequences, never been taught the fundamental skills that turn knowledge into understanding. He's been given everything except the tools to actually succeed on his own merit. What could a cleaner possibly teach a millionaire that the world's most expensive tutors couldn't? The answer will astound you, because sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a person society overlooks possesses the exact key another person desperately needs. And sometimes, just sometimes, a chance encounter in an empty classroom can rewrite the entire trajectory of two lives. Caleb sits in his penthouse every night, surrounded by luxury that would make kings jealous, staring at failing grades that no amount of money can fix. The weight of his family's expectations crushes down on him like a boulder. The Mercer name carries the burden of legacy, of boardroom futures, of an empire that needs an heir. But legacy means nothing if you can't earn it. This isn't a story about money. It's not about privilege or politics or social commentary. This is a story about transformation, about the moment when everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down by someone you never saw coming. If you ever felt like giving up, hit that like button, because what happens next will change how you see failure forever. You're about to witness how the most devastating academic disaster became the greatest learning experience of one young man's life. And the person who made it possible? He cleans floors for minimum wage and carries more wisdom in his worn hands than most CEOs will ever possess. The collision between Caleb's privileged world and Thomas Grant's quiet dignity is about to create something extraordinary. A friendship that breaks every social barrier. A mentorship that redefines success itself. And a secret so powerful, so simple, that it could transform how you approach every challenge in your own life. But before we meet Thomas, you need to understand just how deep Caleb had fallen. The pressure, the shame, the complete disconnection from any sense of purpose or direction. Because only when you see how lost he was can you truly appreciate the miracle of what comes next. Stay with me. The next few minutes will show you that your circumstances don't define your destiny. That wisdom can emerge from anywhere. That the right teacher at the right moment can unlock potential you never knew existed. The story you're about to hear proves that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most humble sources. And by the end, you'll understand why a 19-year-old millionaire credits a night shift cleaner with saving not just his grades, but his entire future. To understand how desperately Caleb needed saving, you first need to see the golden cage that trapped him. The Mercer empire wasn't built overnight. It was forged through Richard Mercer's relentless brilliance in creating software that revolutionized corporate security systems worldwide. 25 years of 16-hour days, Missed family dinners and calculated risks had transformed a college dropout into one of America's most powerful tech moguls. Richard's fortune exceeded $2 billion, but his real pride lay in innovation itself. His software protected governments, Fortune 500 companies, and military installations across 6 continents. Every major corporation trusted Mercer Security Solutions to guard their most sensitive data. The man who once ate ramen noodles for weeks straight now owned companies that shaped global commerce. Meanwhile, Margot Mercer had traded her soprano voice for a different kind of stage. Once destined for La Scala and the Metropolitan Opera, she'd chosen love over career when she met Richard. But she never lost her artistic soul. Their penthouse became a cultural haven. Original Picassos hung beside contemporary sculptures, while rare manuscripts lined mahogany shelves. Margot hosted charity galas that raised millions, her network spanning everyone from senators to symphony conductors. Together, they'd built more than wealth. They'd created a dynasty, and dynasties need heirs. The pressure on Caleb wasn't subtle. Every family gathering became an interrogation disguised as conversation. How are your business classes going? Have you thought about which division of the company interests you most? Your father started planning succession when he was your age. The expectations hung in the air like expensive cologne, impossible to ignore, slowly suffocating. But here's what nobody understood. Caleb had never learned how to actually study. Privilege had been his greatest handicap. When other kids struggled with homework, developing time management, and problem-solving skills, Caleb had tutors who simply gave him answers. When classmates learned perseverance through failure, Caleb's path was smoothed by money and connections. He'd been robbed of the very struggles that build character and capability. At Newbridge University, the most elite institution his family's donations could access, Caleb's academic record read like a disaster report. Microeconomics, D-. Advanced Statistics, F. Corporate Finance, D. International Business Law, F-. His professors stopped calling on him in class, their disappointed expressions speaking louder than words. Professor Martinez from the Business Ethics Department had actually pulled him aside after a particularly brutal exam. "Mr. Mercer," she'd said, her voice heavy with frustration, "I've taught for 30 years. I've seen students overcome language barriers, work 3 jobs while pursuing degrees, fight through learning disabilities to succeed. But I've never seen someone with your advantages struggle this profoundly with basic comprehension." The words stung because they were true. Caleb sat through lectures but retained nothing. He'd stare at textbooks for hours, the words blurring together like foreign code. His mind wandered constantly, to video games, to parties, to anything except the material in front of him. He'd never developed the mental discipline to focus, to push through confusion, to wrestle with difficult concepts until they surrendered their meaning. The gossip followed him everywhere. Students whispered in hallways, "That's Caleb Mercer. His dad could buy the whole university, but he can't even pass freshman-level courses." Faculty members shook their heads in faculty lounges, debating whether his continued enrollment was due to academic merit or financial influence. Each failed exam felt like another nail in his coffin. The shame accumulated like compound interest, growing heavier with every disappointing grade. Caleb would return to his penthouse each evening, luxury surrounding him like a beautiful prison, and stare at the red ink marking his failures. The irony was devastating. He had access to everything except the one thing he desperately needed, the ability to learn. His parents' reactions made everything worse. Richard's disappointment was volcanic but contained, expressing itself through terse questions and heavy silences. How do you expect to run a company if you can't understand basic financial principles? Margot's concern was gentler but equally crushing. She'd suggest different tutors, alternative study methods, even question whether Caleb might have undiagnosed learning differences. But no amount of professional help seemed to penetrate his academic paralysis. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest punishment. While his classmates formed study groups and built friendships through shared struggles, Caleb drifted alone. He was simultaneously too wealthy to relate to students working multiple jobs and too academically weak to connect with the high achievers. He existed in a social no-man's land, watching life happen around him while feeling completely disconnected from meaningful participation. Sleep became his enemy. Every night brought the same torture cycle. lie in his custom bed, worth more than most people's cars, replaying the day's academic humiliations. His mind would race through all the ways he'd disappointed everyone, his professors, his parents, himself. The weight of generational expectations pressed down on his chest like a boulder. The Mercer name carried such prestige, such promise, and he was feeling honored in the most basic way possible. The breaking point arrived on a gray November afternoon with his latest cryptography exam results. Professor Johnson had handed back the test with his usual stern expression, but when he reached Caleb's desk, he paused. The grade wasn't just another F. It was a 23 out of 100, 23%. Caleb had answered questions so incorrectly that he'd somehow demonstrated a negative understanding of the material. "See me after class," Professor Johnson had whispered, his voice carrying both disappointment and genuine concern. The post-class conversation was brutal in its honesty. "Mr. Mercer, I've been teaching cryptography for 15 years. This exam wasn't just failed. It was incomprehensible. You wrote about symmetric algorithms when the question asked about hash functions. You confused basic terminology that we've covered dozens of times. I'm not sure you've understood a single concept we discussed all semester." Caleb sat in that empty classroom afterward, the 23% grade staring back at him like an accusation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while outside, Chicago bustled with people who seemed to understand their purpose in life. He felt more alone than ever before, surrounded by wealth but completely poverty-stricken where it mattered most. Drop a comment if you've ever felt the pressure of living up to impossible standards, because Caleb's about to meet someone who'll change everything. That evening, as Caleb sat surrounded by cryptography textbooks that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics, he had no idea his life was about to take an extraordinary turn. He couldn't have imagined that salvation would come from the most unexpected source, someone society had trained him to overlook completely. But on one cold November night, in an empty classroom, Caleb was about to encounter the most unlikely teacher of his life. While Caleb struggled in his world of privilege and failure, another story was quietly unfolding in the same building, one that would soon intersect with his in the most extraordinary way. Thomas Grant moved through Newbridge University's halls like a ghost with purpose. Tall and lean at 42, with steady hands and observant eyes, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who understood his worth regardless of how others perceived his role. Every night at 9 p.m. sharp, Thomas began his rounds, transforming chaos into order while the academic world slept. His story began 1,500 miles south, in the vibrant neighborhoods of New Orleans, where jazz music floated through humid summer evenings and community meant everything. Thomas had grown up in a shotgun house where 3 generations lived under one roof, where his grandmother's wisdom competed with his grandfather's work ethic for influence over young minds. Education was revered in the Grant household, not as privilege but as possibility. Thomas had been brilliant in high school. Mathematics came to him like breathing, and literature spoke to his soul in ways that surprised teachers who expected less from a kid from his neighborhood. He'd earned a partial scholarship to Tulane University, majoring in engineering, while working nights at a local diner to cover expenses his family couldn't afford. The future stretched before him like an open highway. Then Hurricane Katrina rewrote everyone's story in a matter of hours. The storm took everything: his family's home, his grandmother's life savings, his grandfather's workshop where 3 generations of craftsmanship lived in every tool. Thomas dropped out of college to help rebuild, to work construction jobs that paid immediately instead of investing in a future that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. One emergency led to another, and before he knew it, years had passed. When the recession hit in 2008, the manufacturing plant where Thomas had finally found steady work shuttered its doors permanently. Layoffs swept through New Orleans like another kind of hurricane, and Thomas found himself among thousands competing for jobs that barely existed. With his mother developing diabetes and medical bills mounting, he made the hardest decision of his life, leaving the only home he'd ever known to seek opportunity in the unfamiliar landscape of Chicago. The North was colder than he'd expected, in every sense of the word. People moved differently here, talked differently, looked through him differently. Thomas found work as a night cleaner at Newbridge University, a job that paid the bills and offered health insurance for his mother's medications. It wasn't a career he dreamed of, but it was honest work, and Thomas had never been ashamed of honest work. Here's what the students and faculty at Newbridge never realized. Thomas was the most educated person many of them would ever meet. Not in the formal sense. His college transcript remained unfinished, but in the deeper sense of understanding how the world actually worked. Adversity had been his greatest professor, teaching lessons that no classroom could provide. While cleaning empty lecture halls, Thomas would often pause to read what professors had written on whiteboards. Complex equations, philosophical arguments, historical analyses. He absorbed them all with the hunger of someone who'd been denied the feast of formal education. He'd correct mathematical errors professors had left behind, solve problems they'd posed for tomorrow's classes, and sometimes even leave suggestions in the margins of discarded papers. His most treasured possession was a battered copy of The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin, discovered in a university dumpster, where some student had thoughtlessly discarded it. Thomas had rescued the book, cleaned coffee stains from its pages, and read it dozens of times. The book's central message resonated with his very soul. Learning wasn't about privilege or perfect conditions. It was about adaptation, persistence, and finding wisdom in unexpected places. Every night, as Thomas moved methodically through his rounds, that book rode in his cart alongside cleaning supplies. During break times, he'd sit in empty classrooms and read passages that spoke to his experience. Waitzkin wrote about learning through adversity, about finding strength in struggle, about the difference between those who quit when things get difficult, and those who use difficulty as fuel for growth. Thomas understood something that his wealthy employer's students did not. Learning was liberation, not luxury. Every new concept he mastered, every skill he developed, every insight he gained was a victory that no circumstance could steal from him. While others saw education as an entitlement, Thomas saw it as empowerment. His daily routine was meditation in motion. He'd arrive each evening, change into his uniform, and begin the transformation of academic chaos into order. Empty coffee cups became lessons about consumption and waste. Discarded notes became insights into how different minds process information. Messy classrooms became opportunities to create environments where learning could flourish. Thomas took genuine pride in his work, not because society valued it, but because he understood its true importance. Clean environments supported clear thinking. Organized spaces promoted focused study. Every trash can he emptied, every board he cleaned, every desk he straightened contributed to the educational mission he believed in so deeply. Students walked past him daily without acknowledgement. Professors treated him as furniture that happened to move, but Thomas never let their blindness diminish his sense of purpose. He'd learned long ago that dignity came from within, not from external recognition. His worth wasn't determined by his job title or his paycheck. It was determined by how he showed up in the world, how he treated others, and how he continued growing despite every obstacle. What Thomas possessed that Caleb lacked wasn't money or opportunity. It was perspective. Thomas had learned to find meaning in struggle, to extract wisdom from hardship, to see possibility where others saw only limitation. He understood that the greatest teachers in life weren't necessarily the ones with the most credentials, but the ones who'd learned the most from their journey. Every night, as Thomas finished his rounds and prepared to head home to his small apartment where he cared for his aging mother, he'd allow himself to dream. Maybe someday he'd return to school. Maybe someday he'd finish that engineering degree. Maybe someday he'd prove that circumstances don't define destiny. He had no idea that someday was about to arrive through the most unlikely catalyst possible. Share this video if you believe wisdom can come from anywhere, because you're about to witness a conversation that changes two lives forever. The stage was set for an encounter that would shatter every assumption about who teaches and who learns, about value and worth, about the real meaning of education. Two men from completely different worlds, both struggling with their own form of isolation. We're about to discover that sometimes the most profound connections happen when we least expect them. November 15th, 9:47 p.m. Room 314 of the Computer Science Building. The classroom sat in shadows, illuminated only by the harsh overhead lights that never quite warmed the sterile academic space. Tables arranged in perfect rows faced a whiteboard still covered with Professor Johnson's afternoon cryptography lecture. Equations and algorithms that might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics to the lone figure hunched over textbooks in the front row. Caleb Mercer looked like a man at war with himself. His designer jacket hung carelessly over the back of his chair, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running frustrated fingers through it repeatedly. 3 thick textbooks lay open before him. Applied Cryptography, Mathematical Foundations of Computer Security, and Modern Encryption Methods. Highlighters, pens, and crumpled notebook pages created a battlefield of failed comprehension across the desk. For the past 2 hours, Caleb had been staring at the same chapter on hash functions, reading the same paragraphs over and over until the words lost all meaning. His latest test score, that devastating 23%, burned his memory like a brand. Tomorrow's quiz on digital signatures loomed like an execution date, and he understood exactly nothing about the material. "This is insane," he muttered to the empty room, his voice echoing off the walls. "How can something so many people understand be completely impossible for me?" He flipped back to page 1 of the chapter, hoping that starting over might somehow unlock understanding that had eluded him all evening. The mathematical notation swam before his eyes. The explanations felt like they were written in code themselves. Every sentence assumed knowledge he didn't possess, building on foundations he'd never established. The sound of a cleaning cart's wheels rolling across linoleum broke his concentration. Caleb barely looked up. Cleaning staff were part of the university's invisible infrastructure, background noise he'd been trained to ignore his entire privileged life. He'd probably walked past this same person hundreds of times without acknowledgement. Thomas Grant entered the classroom with his usual quiet efficiency, pushing his cart loaded with supplies, and that battered copy of The Art of Learning tucked beside the spray bottles. He began his routine methodically, emptying the waste baskets, wiping down the whiteboard, straightening chairs that students had left askew. But something made him pause. 23 years of cleaning had taught Thomas to read the emotional residue left in spaces. He could sense when a classroom had hosted a breakthrough moment, when students had struggled with difficult concepts, when professors had grown frustrated with unresponsive audiences. Tonight, the air itself seemed heavy with defeat. The young man at the front table radiated a particular kind of anguish, not the healthy struggle of learning, but the desperate flailing of someone drowning in shallow water. His posture spoke of hours of futile effort. The scattered papers told a story of false starts and abandoned attempts. Thomas had seen this before, but usually in students who lacked resources, not someone whose designer clothes cost more than Thomas earned in months. Privilege, he realized, created its own form of educational poverty. "You look like you're wrestling with a tough problem," Thomas said quietly, continuing to clean while speaking. His voice carried no judgment, no pity, just simple human observation. Caleb's head snapped up, startled. In his world, service staff didn't initiate conversations. They certainly didn't comment on his academic struggles. For a moment, he just stared, unsure how to respond to this breach of social protocol. "Yeah," Caleb said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something approaching shame. "This cryptography stuff just doesn't make sense to me. At all." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, spraying cleaner on the whiteboard and wiping away the day's mathematical remnants. "What part's giving you trouble?" The question was so genuine, so free of condescension, that Caleb found himself answering honestly. "All of it. Hash functions, digital signatures, key distribution. I read the same pages over and over, but nothing sticks. It's like my brain just refuses to process any of it." Thomas paused in his cleaning, studying the whiteboard's fading equations. "Mind if I ask how you're trying to learn it?" Something in Thomas's tone, curious rather than judgmental, made Caleb's defensive walls lower slightly. "Reading, highlighting, taking notes. Same way I approach everything else." He gestured helplessly at his scattered materials, which obviously isn't working. Thomas resumed cleaning, but his attention remained focused on the conversation. "You know, I've noticed something watching students study in these classrooms over the years. The ones who seem to get it aren't necessarily the smartest ones. They're the ones who can explain it back in their own words." Caleb blinked. This wasn't the kind of insight he'd expected from a janitor. "What do you mean?" Thomas set down his cleaning supplies and moved closer, his manner respectful but engaged. "Well, take hash functions. Instead of memorizing the definition, what if you tried explaining to someone, Maybe someone who'd never heard the term before, what a hash function actually does. Like, why would someone need one? Caleb hesitated. I'm not sure I could explain it simply. I barely understand it myself. Exactly. Thomas's eyes lit up with quiet enthusiasm. That's the secret right there. If you can't explain something simply, it means you don't really understand it yet. There's this technique. It's called the Feynman Technique, after the physicist Richard Feynman. Caleb leaned forward despite himself. Never heard of it. Thomas reached into his cleaning cart and pulled out his worn copy of The Art of Learning. He flipped to a dog-eared page and read briefly before looking back up. Feynman believed that if you really understand something, you should be able to explain it to a child. The technique has 4 steps. Pick a concept, explain it in simple terms, identify gaps in your understanding, and then go back to fill those gaps. The young man stared at Thomas with growing amazement. Here was a cleaner quoting physicists and carrying advanced learning theory in his cleaning cart. Everything Caleb thought he knew about intelligence, education, and social hierarchy began shifting like sand. You study learning techniques? Caleb asked, his voice carrying a note of wonder that hadn't been there moments before. Thomas smiled, a hint of pride flickering in his eyes. I study whatever I can get my hands on. Learning doesn't stop just because formal schooling does. He tapped the book gently. Found this in a dumpster a few years back. Been one of my most valuable possessions ever since. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A millionaire's son, receiving wisdom from a book rescued from trash, shared by a man society had trained him to overlook completely. So you're saying, Caleb said slowly, instead of trying to memorize what hash functions are, I should try to explain them like I'm talking to someone who knows nothing about computers? That's exactly what I'm saying. Thomas's enthusiasm was infectious but controlled. When you try to explain something simply, you quickly discover what parts you actually understand and what parts you're just repeating without comprehension. Those gaps? That's where real learning happens. Caleb looked down at his textbooks with new eyes. All those highlighted passages, all those copied definitions. He'd been collecting information without actually processing it. I've never thought about studying that way. Most people don't, Thomas said gently. They think learning is about absorbing information. But real learning is about transformation, taking complex ideas and making them your own by rebuilding them in your own understanding. For the first time in months, something resembling hope flickered in Caleb's chest. Not the desperate hope of someone looking for magic solutions, but the steady hope of someone glimpsing a genuine path forward. Would you? Caleb hesitated, aware he was about to cross social boundaries he'd never questioned before. Would you mind if I tried explaining hash functions to you? Right now? Just to see if this actually works. Thomas's smile was warm and encouraging. I'd be honored to listen. What happened next would change both their lives forever. As Caleb began stumbling through his first attempt at the Feynman Technique, with Thomas asking gentle questions and offering patient guidance, 2 men from completely different worlds discovered something profound. Wisdom recognizes wisdom, regardless of its packaging, and sometimes the most transformative education happens in the most unexpected classrooms. Okay, Caleb said, taking a deep breath and closing his textbook. Let me try to explain hash functions like you've never heard of computers before. Thomas leaned against his cleaning cart, giving Caleb his full attention. There was something powerful about having an engaged listener. Not a professor waiting to grade him, not classmates ready to judge, just another human being genuinely interested in understanding. So, a hash function is like... Caleb paused, his face scrunching in concentration. It's like a machine that takes any piece of information, a document, a password, whatever, and turns it into a fixed-length string of numbers and letters, like a fingerprint for digital information. Interesting, Thomas nodded. Why would someone need that kind of fingerprint? The question exposed the first gap immediately. Caleb realized he'd memorized what hash functions did without understanding why anyone would want such a thing. I'm not really sure why you'd need that. And that's perfectly okay, Thomas said with quiet encouragement. You just found your first learning target. Instead of moving forward without understanding the why, let's stay right here until it makes sense. This was revolutionary thinking for Caleb. Every tutor he'd ever had push him forward when he got stuck. covering material to stay on schedule. Thomas was suggesting they slow down and actually understand. "Let me think about this," Caleb said, his mind working differently than it had in months. "If every piece of information has a unique fingerprint, maybe it's for security? Like, to make sure no one has tampered with a document." Thomas's eyes brightened. "Now you're thinking like someone who actually understands the concept. Keep going. So if I send you a document along with its hash, and you run the same hash function on the document and get a different result, you'd know someone modified it along the way." Caleb felt a spark of genuine excitement. For the first time, cryptography wasn't just abstract symbols. It was solving real problems. "Exactly," Thomas said. "You just explained digital integrity in terms anyone could understand. How does that feel compared to the textbook definition you were trying to memorize?" Caleb laughed, surprised by his own sense of accomplishment. "Completely different. Like I actually get it instead of just repeating words." But the real test came when Thomas asked the next question. "Now explain digital signatures." Caleb's confidence evaporated. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Digital signatures, are there?" He stopped, frustrated. "I have no idea how to explain digital signatures." Here's where Thomas revealed the true power of his teaching philosophy. Instead of moving on or offering the answer, he smiled warmly. "Perfect. You just learned something incredibly valuable." "I learned that I don't know anything about digital signatures," Caleb said, his frustration evident. "No," Thomas corrected gently. "You learn the difference between knowing and not knowing." Most students sit in classes nodding along, thinking they understand everything, until exam day reveals they understood nothing. You just discovered exactly where your real learning needs to begin. This was the moment when Thomas shared the deeper wisdom that would transform not just Caleb's studying, but his entire relationship with failure. "You know what I learned working construction after Hurricane Katrina?" Thomas asked, settling into a chair beside Caleb's desk. "I learned that the strongest buildings aren't the ones that never face storms. They're the ones built to withstand them. Same thing with learning." Caleb found himself leaning forward, hungry for this perspective he'd never encountered. "When I was your age," Thomas continued, "I thought smart people just naturally understood everything. I thought struggling with concepts meant I wasn't cut out for college. So when things got difficult, financially, academically, personally, I gave up. Took me 20 years to realize I had it backwards." "What do you mean?" "The struggle isn't a sign that you're not smart enough. The struggle is where intelligence gets built." Thomas's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Every time you hit something you don't understand, your brain has a choice. Give up or get stronger. Most people give up because they think confusion means failure. But confusion just means you're at the edge of what you currently know, the exact place where growth happens." This philosophy hit Caleb like lightning. His entire educational experience had taught him that confusion was embarrassing, that not understanding immediately meant inadequacy. Thomas was suggesting that confusion was actually the starting point of real learning. "So, when I can't explain digital signatures," Caleb said slowly, "that's not a failure," Thomas finished. "That's an opportunity. That's your brain telling you exactly where to focus your energy." They spent the next hour applying this principle systematically. Thomas would ask Caleb to explain a concept in simple terms. When Caleb got stuck, instead of feeling defeated, he'd identify the specific gap in his understanding. Then he'd return to the textbook, not to memorize, but to find answers to specific questions his explanation attempts had revealed. The transformation was remarkable. Caleb began explaining public key cryptography, like it was a postal system where everyone had public mailboxes but private keys to open them. He described encryption algorithms as recipes that could scramble ingredients so thoroughly that only someone with the exact reverse recipe could unscramble them. "This is incredible," Caleb said after successfully explaining symmetric versus asymmetric encryption. "I've been studying wrong my entire life." "Not wrong," Thomas corrected, "just differently. You were taught to study for grades instead of understanding. There's a big difference." Here Thomas shared a story that would stick with Caleb forever. "When I was working at that manufacturing plant in New Orleans, there was this old-timer named Robert who'd been there 30 years. New guys would come in thinking they knew everything, because they had technical degrees. But when machines broke down, everyone called Robert. You know why? Caleb shook his head. Because Robert didn't just know what buttons to push. He understood what the machines were actually doing. He could explain in plain English why a particular sound meant the bearings were wearing out, or why a certain vibration indicated belt tension problems. The college guys knew the theory, but Robert understood the reality. So the Feynman Technique is like... Caleb paused, applying the method to the method itself. It's like making sure you understand the reality of concepts, not just a theory. Now you're getting it, Thomas said with genuine pride. When you can explain something simply, you prove to yourself that you've moved beyond just memorizing words to actually understanding ideas. As the evening wound down, Thomas shared the most important insight of all. Here's what I want you to remember, he said, packing his book back into the cleaning cart. When you stop fearing mistakes, you open the door to real learning. Mistakes aren't your enemy, they're your teachers. Every gap in your understanding is just showing you where to grow next. Caleb felt something shift fundamentally in his relationship with his studies. The cryptography textbooks on his desk no longer looked like instruments of torture. They looked like puzzles he could actually solve. Thomas, he said as the older man prepared to continue his cleaning rounds, can I ask you something? Of course. How do you know so much about learning and teaching? I mean, Caleb caught himself, realizing he was about to define Thomas by his job rather than his wisdom. Thomas smiled, understanding the unfinished question. Just because formal education ended doesn't mean learning stopped. Sometimes life teaches you things classrooms never could. As Thomas moved toward the door, he turned back with one final thought. The secret isn't in the technique itself, Caleb. The secret is in changing how you think about not knowing. Most people see ignorance as something to hide, but ignorance is just the starting point of wisdom. The only real failure is refusing to begin. Pause this video and try explaining something complex in simple terms. Then comment below what you learn about your own understanding. Caleb sat alone in that classroom for another hour, not struggling with cryptography, but practicing his new superpower, learning how to learn. For the first time in his academic career, he wasn't just collecting information. He was building understanding, one simple explanation at a time. The millionaire's son had just received the most valuable education of his life from a man society had trained him to overlook, and both their worlds were about to change in ways neither could have anticipated. What started as a chance encounter in an empty classroom evolved into something neither Caleb nor Thomas had expected, a friendship that would redefine both their lives. 3 nights after their first meeting, Caleb found himself waiting in room 314 at 9:45 p.m., textbooks spread across the desk, but this time with purpose rather than desperation. When Thomas arrived with his cleaning cart, Caleb looked up with something he hadn't felt in months, genuine excitement about learning. Back again? Thomas asked with a knowing smile. I tried your technique on my statistics homework, Caleb said, barely containing his enthusiasm. I actually understood regression analysis for the first time in my life. I mean, really understood it, not just memorized formulas. Thomas began his cleaning routine, but his attention remained focused on Caleb's breakthrough. Tell me about it. Well, instead of just plugging numbers into equations, I tried explaining regression like I was talking to someone who'd never taken a math class. Caleb's whole demeanor had changed. Gone was a defeated posture, replaced by the animated energy of someone discovering their own capabilities. I described it as finding the best fit line through scattered data points, like trying to draw the straightest path through a field of randomly placed stones. And how did that change your understanding? Everything clicked. I realized regression isn't just about mathematical formulas. It's about finding patterns in chaos, predicting future outcomes based on past data. Suddenly, all those business applications made perfect sense. This became their new routine. Every night after Thomas finished his cleaning rounds at 11 p.m., he'd return to room 314, where Caleb waited with whatever subject was challenging him most. The empty classroom became their private academy, where Millionaire's son learned from a night shift janitor in ways the most expensive tutors had never achieved. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was steady, methodical, built on small victories that accumulated like compound interest. Caleb's first quiz after implementing the Feynman Technique yielded a C+. Not spectacular, but for someone accustomed to failing grades, it felt like winning the lottery. I got a 78 on my cryptography quiz, Caleb announced during their fourth meeting, holding up the paper like a trophy. Thomas paused in organizing desks to examine the grade. How do you feel about it? Proud, Caleb said immediately, then stopped, surprised by his own response. I've never felt proud of a C+ before, but this is different. I earned this. I actually understood the material instead of just guessing. That distinction between inherited success and earned achievement became central to Caleb's transformation. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing the satisfaction of genuine accomplishment, the deep fulfillment that comes from overcoming challenges through effort rather than advantage. As weeks passed, their late-night sessions expanded beyond academics. Thomas would share stories from his life in New Orleans, lessons learned from Hurricane Katrina, wisdom gained from years of being overlooked by society. Caleb found himself fascinated by perspectives he'd never encountered in his privileged bubble. You know what I learned working construction after the storm? Thomas said one evening, while Caleb struggled with international business law concepts. I learned that the foundation determines everything. You can have the most beautiful building in the world, but if the foundation is weak, the whole thing comes down eventually. Caleb looked up from his textbooks, sensing deeper meaning in the metaphor. Same thing with learning, Thomas continued. Most students want to rush to advanced concepts before they built solid foundations. But real understanding is like construction. You build it layer by layer, making sure each level is solid before adding the next. This philosophy revolutionized how Caleb approached his studies. Instead of trying to memorize complex theories, he focused on truly understanding basic principles. Instead of skipping over confusing sections, he stayed with them until clarity emerged. The Feynman Technique became his tool for testing the strength of his academic foundation. The results spoke for themselves. His statistics grade improved from F to C-. His cryptography understanding jumped from 23% to 67%. His business law essays, once incomprehensible rambling, began demonstrating actual analytical thinking. Each improvement was modest, but the trajectory was unmistakable. More importantly, Caleb's relationship with failure transformed completely. When he couldn't explain a concept simply, instead of feeling defeated, he felt curious. Each gap in understanding became a specific target for focused study rather than evidence of inadequacy. I used to think smart people just naturally understood everything, Caleb confided one December evening as snow fell outside the classroom windows. Watching you explain things, I realize intelligence isn't about knowing. It's about figuring out. Thomas smiled at this insight. My grandmother used to say, the smartest person in the room isn't the one with all the answers, it's the one asking the best questions. Their friendship deepened as social barriers dissolved completely. Caleb began arriving earlier, helping Thomas with his cleaning duties while they talked. He learned about Thomas's mother's diabetes, his dreams of returning to school, his quiet pride in work that society undervalued. Thomas learned about the pressure of carrying family expectations, the isolation of privilege, the particular loneliness of having everything except purpose. One evening in mid-December, Caleb made a discovery that would crystallize everything Thomas had taught him. Tucked inside his statistics textbook, he found a note written in Thomas's careful handwriting. Success isn't about what you're born into. It's about what you make yourself into. The message hit Caleb with profound force. He'd spent his entire life defining himself by circumstances beyond his control, his family's wealth, his inherited advantages, his genetic lottery. Thomas was suggesting that real success came from choices, effort, and character, things entirely within his power to shape. That note became Caleb's personal manifesto. He taped it to his dorm room mirror, where it reminded him daily that his worth wasn't determined by his trust fund, but by his willingness to grow, to struggle, to become someone worthy of the opportunities he'd been given. The change in Caleb's character became visible to everyone around him. His professors noticed increased engagement in class discussions. His few friends observed him asking different questions, approaching problems with genuine curiosity rather than entitled frustration. His parents, during their weekly phone calls, heard something new in his voice. Confidence earned rather than assumed. By winter break, Caleb had achieved something unprecedented in his academic career. He was actually enjoying learning, not just the satisfaction of good grades, but the deeper pleasure of understanding, of making connections between concepts, of feeling his mind expand with each new insight. Thomas watched his transformation with quiet satisfaction, finding purpose he'd never experienced in any previous job. Every breakthrough Caleb achieved felt like validation of Thomas's own journey, proof that his struggles hadn't been meaningless if they could help someone else avoid the same mistakes. You know what's interesting? Caleb said during their last session before winter break, "I'm starting to think you're the best teacher I've ever had." Thomas was quiet for a moment, touched by the acknowledgement, but also aware of the deeper truth it represented. The best teachers aren't necessarily the ones with the most credentials, Caleb. Sometimes they're just the ones who believe in your ability to learn. As they prepared to part for the holidays, both men understood that something extraordinary had occurred. A relationship that began as chance encounter between a failing student and an overlooked worker had evolved into genuine mentorship, mutual respect, and friendship that transcended every social boundary society had taught them to respect. The transformation was just beginning. By February, the impossible had happened. Professor Johnson approached Caleb after his advanced cryptography class with an expression that bordered on amazement. "Mr. Mercer, I need to speak with you," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual stern disappointment. Caleb's stomach clenched, expecting another conversation about poor performance. Instead, Professor Johnson smiled, something Caleb had never witnessed before. "I want to invite you to join our honors seminar next semester," the professor said. "Your recent work has been exceptional. Your essay on blockchain security applications showed genuine insight, not just regurgitation of textbook material. What changed?" The question hung in the air as Caleb realized the magnitude of his transformation. 6 months ago, he'd been failing every exam. Now he was being invited into advanced coursework reserved for the university's top students. "I learned how to actually learn," Caleb said simply, thinking of Thomas and their late-night sessions in room 314. That honors invitation marked more than academic recovery. It represented complete personal transformation. Caleb no longer saw himself as the wealthy failure destined to disappoint everyone. He becomes someone who could master difficult concepts, someone whose insights had value, someone who'd earned his achievements rather than inherited them. But the most profound change came in how Caleb chose to use his newfound abilities. "I want to help other struggling students," he told Thomas during one of their regular sessions. "There are kids here working 3 jobs who can't afford tutors, who are failing not because they lack intelligence, but because no one ever taught them how to study effectively." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Sounds like you understand that real success isn't just about personal achievement." Within weeks, Caleb had established informal tutoring sessions in the library's group study rooms. His first student was Maria Santos, a pre-med sophomore from a working-class family who was drowning in organic chemistry despite working harder than anyone else in the class. "I've read this chapter 15 times," Maria said in frustration, pointing to her chemistry textbook. "I know all the vocabulary, I've memorized the reactions, but I still don't understand how any of it actually works." Caleb smiled, recognizing his former self in her struggle. "What if I told you that memorizing isn't understanding? Let me show you something called the Feynman Technique." For the next hour, Caleb guided Maria through the same process Thomas had taught him. Instead of memorizing reaction mechanisms, she learned to explain them as if teaching a friend who'd never taken chemistry. The transformation was immediate and profound. "Oh my God," Maria said, her face lighting up with genuine comprehension. Nucleophilic substitution isn't just a random reaction. It's like a molecular dance where one molecule strategically replaces another based on electron attraction. Watching Maria's breakthrough, Caleb experienced something he'd never felt before, the deep satisfaction of empowering someone else's success. He understood why Thomas found such purpose in their late-night teaching sessions. Word spread quickly about Caleb's tutoring approach. Soon he was working with a dozen students across various subjects, always teaching the same fundamental principle: simplify to understand, understand to master. His study groups became legendary on campus, not because he provided easy answers, but because he taught students how to find answers themselves. But Caleb's transformation extended beyond academics into social consciousness. His friendship with Thomas had opened his eyes to the university's invisible workforce, the cleaners, maintenance staff, food service workers whose labor made student life possible, but whose contributions went unrecognized and undercompensated. During spring semester, Caleb did something that shocked the entire university community. He requested time to address the board of trustees, using his family name to secure access to the most powerful decision-makers on campus. Distinguished board members, Caleb began, standing before men and women who controlled hundreds of millions in university assets. I want to talk about the people who make our educational mission possible, but whom we consistently overlook. He presented a comprehensive proposal for improving wages, benefits, and career development opportunities for university support staff. He'd researched comparable institutions, analyzed budget allocations, and created a sustainable funding model that could transform working conditions without compromising academic programs. Excellence in education requires excellence in all aspects of our community. Caleb argued passionately. We cannot claim to be a world-class institution while treating essential workers as expendable. The board was stunned, not just by the proposal's quality, but by its source. This was the same student they'd heard about as an academic disaster, now demonstrating leadership and social awareness that impressed seasoned administrators. The proposal passed unanimously, leading to significant improvements in staff compensation and working conditions. But Caleb's most ambitious project was still ahead. Working with his parents' foundation, Caleb established a Grand Educational Opportunity Fund, named, of course, for Thomas, providing full scholarships for university employees and their families to pursue higher education. The fund would cover tuition, books, living expenses, and provide additional support to ensure recipients could succeed academically while managing work and family responsibilities. Thomas was the fund's first recipient. I can't accept this, Thomas said when Caleb presented him with the scholarship documentation. This is too much. I'm 42 years old, which means you have decades left to use your education to help others. Caleb interrupted gently. You gave me something invaluable. Let me give you something back. Thomas stared at the papers with tears in his eyes. After 24 years, his dream of completing college was finally within reach. Besides, Caleb added with a smile, who's going to help me with advanced engineering courses if you're not enrolled too? The scholarship fund made headlines across Chicago, celebrated as an innovative approach to educational equity. But for Caleb and Thomas, it represented something much more personal. The completion of a circle that had begun with a chant encounter in an empty classroom. Even Caleb's parents noticed a dramatic change in their son. During a family dinner at their penthouse, Richard and Margot Mercer marveled at the transformation. You're different, Margot observed, watching Caleb discuss his tutoring work with genuine passion. More confident, but also more grounded. I learned something important, Caleb replied. Success isn't about what advantages you have. It's about what you do with them. And the best thing you can do with advantages is share them. Richard, the self-made billionaire who built an empire through individual achievement, found himself reconsidering his own definition of success as he watched his son create opportunities for others. By the end of his sophomore year, Caleb had achieved something far greater than academic recovery. He'd transformed from a privileged failure into a leader who understood that true success multiplies when shared. His grades were excellent, but more importantly, his character had been forged through genuine struggle and authentic achievement. Thomas, meanwhile, had enrolled in mechanical engineering courses, studying alongside students young enough to be his children, but approaching his education with the wisdom and determination that only life experience can provide. Their friendship had created expanding circles of positive impact. Struggling students who learned to learn, university workers who gained dignity and opportunity, a community that recognized the potential in everyone regardless of their background. The millionaire's son and the night janitor had discovered a truth that transcended all social boundaries. When we lift others up, we rise higher ourselves. 2 years later, on a sunny May morning, Newbridge University's graduation ceremony buzzed with the energy of achievement and anticipation. Thousands of families filled the stadium, but in the VIP section, one particular group drew curious glances, not because of their wealth or status, but because of the unusual composition of their celebration. Richard and Margot Mercer sat beside Thomas Grant and his elderly mother, who had traveled from New Orleans to witness a moment she'd dreamed about for decades. The boundaries that once seemed insurmountable had dissolved completely, replaced by genuine friendship and mutual respect. Caleb Mercer walked across that stage as valedictorian in his class, but the academic honors felt secondary to a deeper transformation. As he shook the dean's hand and accepted his diploma, his eyes found Thomas in the crowd. The man who had saved his academic career and his life was applauding with tears of pride. But graduation was only half the victory being celebrated that day. 3 hours later, across town at Chicago Community College, another ceremony took place with far less pomp but equal significance. Thomas Grant, at 44, walked across a different stage to receive his associate degree in engineering, the first step in completing the journey he'd begun 24 years earlier. Caleb was there, of course, cheering louder than anyone as his mentor and friend achieved a dream deferred but never abandoned. Watching Thomas receive his diploma, Caleb understood something profound about success. It's never too late to become who you're meant to be. The transformation extended far beyond individual achievements. The Mercer family empire, once focused solely on accumulating wealth, had evolved into something richer and more meaningful. Richard incorporated the Grant Educational Opportunity Fund directly into Mercer Security Solutions, making educational support for employees and their families a cornerstone of company culture. You taught us something important, Richard told Thomas during the graduation celebration dinner. We thought we were successful because we'd built wealth, but you showed us that real success is building people. Margot, her artist soul touched by the beauty of authentic transformation, had redirected much of her philanthropic work toward educational equity initiatives. The opera galas continued, but now they funded scholarships for first-generation college students rather than just supporting already established cultural institutions. The partnership between Caleb and Thomas had become legendary on campus and beyond. Their story, the millionaire's son and the janitor who became each other's greatest teachers, was featured in national education journals, inspiring similar mentorship programs at universities across the country. But perhaps the most profound change was in how success itself was defined within the Mercer family legacy. During his valedictorian speech, Caleb addressed the graduating class with words that would be quoted for years to come. We often measure success by what we accumulate: grades, wealth, status, achievements. But I learned something that changed my life forever. True success is measured by what we contribute. The most successful person I know spent his nights cleaning classrooms while studying engineering textbooks by fluorescent light. He taught me that wisdom isn't found in lecture halls or boardrooms. It's found in the willingness to learn from anyone, anywhere, at any time. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. My greatest teacher didn't have a PhD or published research papers. He had something more valuable: the understanding that education is a great equalizer, that potential exists everywhere, and that the highest form of achievement is lifting others as you climb. Thomas, watching from the faculty section where he now worked as an engineering lab assistant while completing his bachelor's degree, felt a pride that transcended any personal accomplishment. The Mercer empire had truly transformed. Company meetings now began with discussions about employee development alongside profit margins. Board presentations included metrics for social impact, as well as financial returns. The corporate culture shifted from pure competition to collaborative growth, from individual achievement to collective success. Caleb's tutoring programs had evolved into a university-wide initiative, with dozens of student mentors teaching the Feynman Technique and study strategies that emphasize understanding over memorization. Academic improvement rates soared, but more importantly, students were discovering the joy of genuine learning. Thomas, meanwhile, had become something of a campus celebrity, not for his janitorial background, but for his unique perspective as a non-traditional student who brought real-world wisdom to theoretical discussions. Professors invited him to share insights with younger students, and his story became required reading in several education courses. Their friendship remained the constant foundation beneath all these expanding changes. Every Tuesday evening, they still met in room 314, no longer for emergency tutoring, but for ongoing discussions about learning, growth, and how to maximize the impact of their evolving platform. You know what I realized? Caleb said during one of these sessions. You didn't just teach me how to study. You taught me how to see people, really see them beyond their titles or circumstances. Thomas smiled, organizing papers from his latest engineering course. And you taught me that dreams don't expire. Sometimes they just take longer to achieve than we originally planned. The true inheritance Caleb would carry forward wasn't measured in dollars or stock options. It was measured in wisdom gained, character developed, and the understanding that privilege is only valuable when it serves a purpose larger than personal comfort. By the time both men walked across their respective graduation stages, they had created something that would outlast any individual achievement, a model for how education can transform not just individuals, but entire communities when it's approached with humility, curiosity, and genuine respect for the wisdom that exists in every human being. The millionaire's son had learned the most valuable lesson of all. True wealth isn't what you inherit. It's what you create, what you share, and what you leave behind for others to build upon. What started as a story of a failing millionaire's son and an overlooked janitor became something far more powerful. Proof that transformation is always possible, wisdom exists everywhere, and the most meaningful success comes from lifting others as you rise. Caleb Mercer's journey from academic disaster to valedictorian teaches us something fundamental about the nature of true achievement. Success isn't about the circumstances you're born into. It's about what you choose to make of yourself despite those circumstances. Privilege can open doors, but it can't walk through them for you. Wealth can buy opportunity, but it can't purchase understanding. Only effort, humility, and the willingness to learn can transform potential into reality. The real hero of this story isn't the millionaire's son who overcame his struggles. It's the night shift cleaner who saw potential where everyone else saw failure and chose to invest his wisdom in another human being. Thomas Grant represents millions of overlooked individuals whose intelligence, experience, and insights remain invisible to society that judges worth by job titles and paychecks rather than character and capability. Their unlikely friendship shattered every assumption about who teaches and who learns, who has value and who doesn't, who deserves respect and who can be ignored. When Caleb finally learned to see Thomas not as just a janitor, but as a brilliant teacher and mentor, he discovered that the greatest education comes from recognizing humanity and wisdom in every person we encounter. The Feynman Technique that saved Caleb's academic career is available to anyone reading this right now. You don't need expensive tutors or elite universities to master this approach. You need only the willingness to admit what you don't understand and the patience to rebuild your knowledge from the ground up, one simple explanation at a time. Real learning happens when you stop trying to impress others with what you think you know and start honestly examining what you actually understand. But the deeper lesson transcends study techniques and academic success. This story reveals that genuine transformation requires breaking down the barriers we've built between ourselves and others. How many Thomas Grants do we walk past every day without recognition? How many opportunities for mutual learning do we miss because we've been trained to see certain people as invisible? Social equity isn't just about policy changes or systemic reforms, though those matter tremendously. It's also about individual choices to recognize worth where society has taught us not to look. Every time we engage with someone across class lines, every time we listen to perspectives different from our own, every time we acknowledge that wisdom comes from experience rather than credentials, we contribute to a more just and connected world. The transformation of the Mercer family empire from pure profit to purpose-driven business proves that commercial success and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. When companies invest in their employees' growth, when wealthy families use their resources to create opportunities for others, when privilege becomes a platform for lifting up rather than standing above, entire communities benefit. Thomas Grant's return to college at 44 demonstrates that it's never too late to pursue deferred dreams. Life circumstances may delay our goals, but they don't have to defeat them. Sometimes the detours we take, whether through hurricanes, recessions, or unexpected responsibilities, give us exactly the wisdom and perspective we need to succeed when opportunity finally arrives. The ongoing friendship between Caleb and Thomas proves that authentic relationships can transcend any social boundary when they're built on mutual respect, genuine learning, and shared commitment to growth. Their Tuesday evening meetings in room 314 continue to this day. Two men from completely different worlds who discover that the most meaningful connections happen when we're willing to be vulnerable about what we don't know and grateful for what others can teach us. Before you go, I need you to do 3 things. First, like this video if it reminds you that learning never stops and that your circumstances don't define your potential. Second, comment below and tell me, who was an unexpected teacher in your life? Maybe it was a co-worker, a neighbor, someone in a service job who shared wisdom that changed your perspective. I want to hear your stories of unlikely mentorship and unexpected learning. Third, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because next week, I'm sharing another story that proves ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept limitations others place on them. 5 years later, Caleb Mercer runs educational initiatives that have transformed lives across dozens of universities. Thomas Grant completed his engineering degree and now teaches at the community college where he once earned his associate degree, inspiring other non-traditional students to pursue their delayed dreams. Their story continues to demonstrate that the most powerful changes begin with simple human connection and the courage to see potential where others see only problems. The secret Thomas shared with Caleb that cold November night is still changing lives today. When you stop fearing mistakes and start embracing them as teachers, when you choose curiosity over pride, when you recognize that everyone has something valuable to offer, you open yourself to transformations you never thought possible. True wealth isn't what you inherit. It's what you learn, what you share, and what you leave behind. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this extraordinary story here on Soul Igniting Story. I truly appreciate you for taking the time to be with us, to open your heart, and to let these words spark something within your soul. Every story we share is crafted to inspire, to uplift, and to remind us all that love, hope, and resilience are alive in every corner of the world. If this story touched you, made you smile, or even brought a little spark of wonder to your day, I would be so grateful if you would show your support. Please give this video a like. It helps more souls discover these stories. Don't forget to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, feelings, or even your own experiences connected to the story. Your words make this community come alive. And of course, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next beautiful journey we'll be sharing together. Until next time, thank you again for being part of the Soul Igniting Story family, where every story lights a flame within.